One of the areas that I've been heavily involved with for a long time, and again, it's sort of spanned the length of much of my career, has been Indigenous mental health and Indigenous people's understandings of mental health problems and indeed of self and personhood. And this stems from my first encounters in working in the north of Quebec in Nunavik, when I was invited to come and work as a psychiatric consultant for the communities, particularly on the Hudson coast. And this was a context in which there was a hospital built in Pavungatuk, very space age, looks like a flying saucer landed in the middle of the tundra. In fact, when anything broke down, they had to get somebody from California to fly in to fix things. It was like, cutting edge technology. And increasing provision of health services that was occurring, partly, I think, as a result of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement and the ways in which Inuit were included in that. And a situation in which there were mainly nurse practitioners and family doctors who were providing healthcare services. And then they would ask for certain consultants to come to supplement or complement their own work. So I was invited by family doctor Michael Malice and by Andre Corriveau, who was the medical director at the time at Unalitsevik Health Center in Pavungatuk. And when I went there, first of all, I should say it was a profound experience in the sense of, being within my home province, within my home country, and suddenly being in a totally different environment, a totally different world. Geographically, ecologically, culturally, politically, just very profoundly different. And being struck very quickly by this problem that unfortunately persists to this day of serious health disparities for Indigenous populations, for Inuit in particular, in Canada. And so there had not been a psychiatrist there for a very long time. I was asked to see many patients to reassess people who, in some cases, had already been on psychiatric treatment, been given a prescription of an old psychiatric medication years ago, and it was just renewed year after year after year without being reassessed. I also saw many young people in their teens, mid-teens, who had made suicide attempts. And when I would ask them what was going on, usually the story would be something like they broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and that was very painful, and they were very distraught. Sometimes there would be a story of conflict at school, at work, with family. And sometimes people would just say, I was bored, which for me, I was a bit taken aback because I thought, well, I experienced boredom too as an adolescent, and sometimes I was distressed by it, but it seems like suicide attempt is an extreme response to that. So there was several things that were confusing. One was how people presented the problem, and the other was it seems like there's a whole cohort of people who are having this problem. So is it an individual problem? Is it a social problem? How should this be approached? And since I came at this already with an interest in culture, and part of my reason for being there was not only to be helpful and do hopefully useful work, but also to learn something about cultural worlds, I tried to dig into this. And so with Michael Malice, we did an initial epidemiological study. We got a grant and partnered with the mayor of the hamlet to do a study and interviewed 100 young people about suicide. We found a very high rate of attempted suicide, a very high rate of serious attempts of suicide. So this was extremely alarming. And it then led us to feel again that we needed to do other work, that doing quantitative work where one simply counts up symptoms or counts up experiences is only part of gives you an overall picture of certain things, but it doesn't tell you what's going on, and you don't even know in some cases what the questions are to ask until you have deeper conversations with people. In the course of that, so that led to work that's continued up to the present, epidemiological work, qualitative work, trying to understand Indigenous suicide. And I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the other things that happened early on was, as I was consulting and seeing cases and talking with people, I was asked by the community workers, Inuit community workers, to go on the radio, FM radio in each hamlet, where people sort of talk among themselves and, you know, play music and talk all day long, and go on the radio to talk about mental health, and in particular to explain to people that mental health problems are not caused by demon possession. So I was again a bit taken aback, because I thought, well, who says they're caused by demon possession? And I told them I'm not getting on the radio and saying anything until I know who I'm talking to. You know, because sure, I'm happy to share, this is what we think about mental health problems today, but you know, you can't do any education or sharing of knowledge if it's not a dialogue. So we decided that we had to do another project on Inuit concepts and understanding of mental health and illness. So this became, we got a grant from the Quebec, I think from the FRSQ at this point, or maybe CQRS, I don't remember, with Ellen Corin, with others, to do a project on Inuit concepts of mental health and illness. And this involved, I was already doing participant observation in a sense by being there and by working with community workers and asking what's going on. And I had many interesting observations from that. But we decided to do key informant interviews. We interviewed, I think, more than 80 people at length. And we used a method that had been proposed originally by Henry Murphy and developed by Alain Corin for WHO, which tried not to introduce the idea of mental health per se, because people may or may not have a concept of that, and you don't know what they include in that. But instead would ask people about certain behaviors, simple behaviors. Is there somebody around here who walks around and it looks like they're hearing something nobody else can hear? You know, some simple description of auditory hallucinations. Or somebody who believes things that are not true, and no matter what you tell them, they don't change their belief. So some simple, I'm not giving you the exact accounts here, but they were like one-sentence descriptions of basic psychiatric type symptoms, with the idea that that becomes an entree to try to collect information. And the goal was not to say, tell me about that kind of problem, but tell me about a person who has that problem. Because again, the notion was, by getting people to talk about concrete instances, you'll be getting much closer to their actual experience, to the everyday language they use for making sense of that experience, and for things that might be connected that would not be connected under a formal label, if you ask what it is. So we were able to collect a lot of interesting interviews, recorded these interviews and transcribed them. Some were in Inuktitut with an interpreter, some were in English. Chris Fletcher, who went on to do a master's and PhD. Actually, at that time he was probably a master's student, and then with me and with Gilles, and then is now a professor at Université Laval. Was a key person in this project because he was working with Inuit, he had friends and so on, so he was one of the research assistants who worked on this. And a lot of interesting things came out of this. One thing that came out of it was that, yes, there were people who believed in demon possession. The model came from Southern Pentecostal religion, and people sometimes quoted even images that came from the film The Exorcist, and they thought that could be the cause of psychosis, for example. But people also thought that severe mental illness, psychosis, whatever, could be caused by lack of love when you were a child. So a very psychological, if you will, kind of explanation, more so than was credited in psychiatry at the time. And people also thought that illness could come because you're not eating properly. So when we asked elders, what's the thing you can do to promote mental health, their main suggestion was get people to eat country food, because country food is really the source of mental strength and physical strength. You know, so this is what makes you a human being, it's what makes you healthy. So this is a very different notion of the sense of the person in relation to the environment and so on that was important. So I'll come back to that later because it's led to work on the sort of cultural concept of the person and how that might relate to our sense of self and functioning and so on. But the preoccupation for the communities at that time, and still unfortunately to this day, was a lot around the problem of suicide, which is terrible loss of life and unprecedented, and certainly not what happened in traditional life, notwithstanding the sort of popular image of the Inuit as having this altruistic suicide. To the extent that that ever existed, that was something that people who were old and sick did to protect the group, not something that somebody young and healthy did to take their own life. So this was the idea that teenagers, young people, people whose whole life is supposed to be ahead of them would feel so miserable that they would end their lives, was very disturbing to everyone. So we had a long series of studies, different epidemiological studies, including helping to design surveys that were done as part of the Santé Québec Inuit Health Survey, as part of the International Polar Year Circumpolar Survey, and so on, trying to identify risk and protective factors related to suicide. So taking a sort of social epidemiological approach that says that within the whole community is definitely affected by things, but within the community, even though it's a lot of people, it's still only some people who are having this. So can we look for the individual variation within the larger frame and figure out what those vulnerability factors are? And we found a number, some things you might expect, different kinds of trauma exposures and things that people might have that contribute to that. But we also found some interesting sort of countervailing things. So we found among young people, attendance at church was a protective factor for people. So that was interesting. And at the time in psychiatry, religiosity, religious practice was not something that was studied very much. It was not very popular, maybe partly because of the influence of Freud. There was a sort of attitude that this was, problematic. And so, pointing toward the idea that social connectedness, involvement, which is probably the main thing people are getting out of church in that context, young people in that context, was very important for people's well-being. The suicide work has continued, in different ways, but at some point in the process, or really all along, people were saying, please, you need to do something to address this. One of the things that happened, I should say, related to this Indigenous work was I discovered in doing this that there were people across the country in Canada doing work with Indigenous groups, but there was no sharing, there was no sort of connection. So with the support of the CQRS in Quebec, we started a Native or an Aboriginal mental health research team with the idea that we would connect all the people in Quebec who were working on Indigenous health, and we would share ideas. And then when the head of social science in Quebec went to Ottawa, to SSHRC, they started a similar program around community-university partnerships, and we were able to turn our program into a national program. And that occurred right around the time that the CHR was being created. So eventually our program got folded into or supported by the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health. So we were able to create a national network for Aboriginal mental health research. And the goal was, first of all, to just make people aware of what each other were doing so we could share ideas and resources. The goal was also to bring together social science, and mental health, psychology, other kinds of disciplines to think about the mental health needs of communities, and especially, and this was really the primary agenda of the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, to build capacity within communities for Indigenous people to do their own health research. Because research in general has a very bad name among Indigenous people, because they basically associate it with state surveillance and control rather than the actual solutions to their problems. For me, going up there originally as a practitioner, we were able to do these initial projects because it was sympathetic. If I said, look, I really want to help the young people here, but we don't know what's going on, we need to collect some information, there was much more receptivity to that point, because my reason for being there was not to do a study and go off and write a book. It was, I'm here, I'll be here next month to do more consultations. Hopefully we'll learn something, it'll help us do better work, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a more natural quid pro quo, if you will, or not even quid pro quo, just a justification or legitimation for doing this kind of work. And that served us well. But the one thing that happened, as I say, we did all this basic work with various partners on looking at risk and protective factors and contributors, trying to frame this in a larger way. At the same time as this was going on, there were a lot of things happening at the same time. Again, I'm not going to get the precise sequence right, but we also went through this process of having the Oka crisis here in Montreal, and a kind of insurrection where people said because of the violence being done against Indigenous people and appropriation of land and so on. There was a pushback. It was a big crisis socially, and it led to the creation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So that was a lengthy process of beginning to document what was going on and try to make policy recommendations. The head of research for that program was Dara Culhane, an anthropologist, sociologist, anthropologist. I think it's Simon Fraser at the time, or I think so. And she approached me because I'd been doing some of this work and published a little bit to do a review on suicide for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So we wrote a lengthy report. We read everything we could get our hands on and tried to write a synthesis based on some of our own research, but mainly on all that had been written. And that became a key document for one of the first reports published by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples called, what's it called now? I'm blocking on the title. I'll have to look at
Suicide
it.
Among Aboriginal People? The one?
That's what our report is called. Their report was, I'm blocking on it. I can look it up after, but it's got a particular title because it's on suicide. They wrote us. I'll look it up quickly, so I'll continue from there. Because it's important, and you can show a picture of it. It's actually, because it cites our report about 20, 30, 40 times. So, choosing life. That's what I didn't find it, but I remembered it. Thank you. Okay, so they published. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was a lengthy process. There were many issues they were trying to address and bring together, but one of the first interventions they made was to publish a separate standalone part of their report called Choosing Life, which specifically addressed the issue of suicide. And that made heavy use of the review that we'd done where we tried to synthesize what was known. And then we were asked to do a second report on mental health more generally. So we created a second detailed report that covered the gamut of mental health issues, which is a challenge because, this includes many things. Mental health goes from, on the one hand, to, severe psychosis and people with chronic illnesses, to all of us every day when we're worrying about what am I going to do with my life and what does it all mean and whatever. You can, depending upon the environment you're in and the kind of mental health practitioner you see, we put all that under some big rubric. And that's interesting for communities again, too, because they would say, well, there's a small number of people with very severe mental illness, but there are many, many people who are troubled by the history and the marginalization and the racism and the other things that Indigenous people have had to endure in Canada as in other settler societies. So we did that other review, which again became an important input, and then we turned that into a series of articles. We did some review articles. At the same time, as I say, we got this network funded, this national network, and so we were able to begin to train ourselves, first of all, to do research in a way that was respectful of communities, but also to begin to train our own students and to train Indigenous students. So there was gradually more and more Indigenous scholars who were being trained in mental health research and the areas that we're working on, and we were able to have a series of coordinators who went through that in no particular order. One of the people was Carolyn Tate, who's an anthropologist who did her work with Margaret Locke and who then did a postdoc working with this network and has been a professor of anthropology in the Department of Psychiatry for many years at the University of Saskatchewan. And she did her work actually on fetal alcohol syndrome and the ways in which Indigenous people were being slotted into that category, whereas a non-Indigenous child with the same symptoms might be told that they had ADHD, attention deficit disorder. So the diagnosis, which whatever its validity, was being used in particular ways that revealed certain biases in how people saw Indigenous people and created certain dilemmas for people in terms of how they make use of psychiatric diagnosis. So this anticipates what one of our major concerns has been in other areas of our work, which is what the philosopher Ian Hacking has called the looping effect, in which categories get created within psychiatry or elsewhere, and they take on a social life, a social reality that reshapes people's experiences in a kind of circular way. And this is a major challenge for psychiatry. One of the things that happened, though, with the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health, and I was on the advisory board at some point early on, Jeff Redding, a Mohawk physiologist with the mentorship of John O'Neill, an anthropologist, became the first head of the Institute for Aboriginal People's Health. And they funded our network, but they eventually funded a call for proposals on resilience after quite a number of years. And for us, this was a great opportunity to move from the focus on pathology and problems which were obvious and manifest and important, but which were very exhausting for the community to keep revisiting without a sense of how do we go from here. To keep just counting up the problems was sometimes unbearable for people, even though in reality there's to this day not enough information of the kind we would want to have to make wise policy and so on. But in any event, so we got funded to do a project on resilience. And it was intended originally to be a cross-national project. It would involve partners in Australia and New Zealand. And the structure of the grant was supposed to be that each group in the three countries would apply to their own agency and get their own funding, but it would be a coordinated project, so the methodology could be similar and so on. So in the end, the Australian group was not able to get their funding, interestingly, partly because they insisted that they were going to develop a new Indigenous methodology, which is still an ongoing process and debate. But what was interesting at that time, quite a few years ago now, that became a non-starter. That by insisting on that, the scientists who were viewing the grant basically said, we don't know what you're talking about. So that did not work well for them. The New Zealand group did get funded and were able to do some interesting work, and there came to meetings that we organized here, and I went there, and we did a number of things collaboratively. For us, what was interesting was, in the end, we developed an approach that got people to talk about their ideas of resilience, not using the word resilience necessarily, but saying people who've done well despite adversity. And the first part of the toolkit, the interview we had, would just ask people, what are some of the kinds of adversity that you experience here individually and as a community? So for example, when we talked to the Mohawk and Ganawage, one of their sources of adversity was the building of the seaway. It's not a thing that most Canadians would think. We think the seaway is a nation-building enterprise. It's only good, right? Big ships can come inland. It's a good thing. From their point of view, this is our land. This is Mother Earth. It's being carved away. And now we have this, this ugly whatever kind of, and we look across the river and there's that place over there, the city, and so on. So it was a very different shift in perspective in terms of what the adversity is. And then the question was, okay, people who've done well, or families or communities, we actually asked the questions at multiple levels, not just individually, as we would tend to do in a psychological approach, but also tell me about families or tell me about communities that have done well. And then we'd ask why, or what do you think's going on? And we'd ask them again about things at different levels. So what came out of that was, and our explicit goal in all this was to say, look, resilience is an emerging industry. The idea that we're going to find things about strengths and positivity, it's all good. And some of the things people find are very straightforward. Yes, if you're more intelligent, if you're more attractive, if you're more flexible, there are some general traits that it makes perfect sense. Having a lot of that is useful. What can we add? What can we find by talking to Indigenous people that is not being included? And so we worked in a variety of communities, in each case with a partner from within the community and a partner from without. At one point, Stefan Dandino, who's a Métis social psychologist, did a postdoc with me, so he was the outsider for some communities, but he also worked with his own community, with the Métis in Manitoba. So we ended up having 4 main ones that we included in a paper where we summarize some of these. We work with the Inuit, and we work with Mi'kmaq in Eskasoni. We worked with the Mohawk and Ganawage, and we work with the Métis in Manitoba. In each case, as I say, with a scholar from within the community, an Indigenous person. And we tried to characterize what was distinctive, what were they raising. And what we found, interestingly enough, was a series of things. Cultural revitalization, which makes perfect sense for Indigenous people, because that's what's been deliberately suppressed by the policies of colonialism and residential schools and so on. Recuperation of language and culture, connection to the land, which fits with being Indigenous in a particular way. So the land itself was meaningful to people. I gave that example just now of the seaway being experienced as a visceral thing, not just as it's a piece of our property that's being taken away, much more like it's a piece of my body that is being. I remember flying into a northern Inuit village, and the guy sitting next to me on the plane looked down and said, I know that river better than the palm of my hand. So this immediate, embodied connection to place that is not so familiar, let's say, to city dwellers. We might have that when we go to the country, but we sort of have to shield ourselves a little bit in in the urban environment. A connection to storytelling and a notion of stories, and this fits again with being primarily oral traditions for most of these communities, and the notion that a story is something that's kind of alive. So when you hear a story, it becomes part of you, it stays inside you, and its meaning can become apparent later on. So it's not like Sunday school, okay, here's the story of Adam and Eve, and what does this teach us? It's more like, no, this is the story of creation or the Sky Woman, and you just hear it, and you hear it again and again. And then what people would tell us is, when I was in this problem, I remembered the story of Sky Woman, and I felt encouraged, or I felt like I could endure. So it's like they're drawing from something that they hadn't thought through yet what the meaning was. The meaning became apparent in the moment. And the final thing that came up was political activism. And this, again, these were not equal in all communities. It depended. In the case of the Mohawk, definitely political activism has been very important, and it's also culturally consonant. It fits with having a warrior society. It fits with having different elements of their traditions that really fit with that well. So this work on resilience was very important, and one of the challenges was giving something back to the community. So in each case, we tried to work with the community to produce materials that they could use. So these materials were produced for the Métis and for the Mohawk that, in a sense, could be used in schools and would help people to reflect on their own knowledge that they were sharing with us in this process. That work then led to, I'll talk in the next segment, led to the next step, which is really talking about mental health promotion, actually not just documenting and paying attention to the strengths and resilience, but actually finding ways to try to support that, to contribute to that, to mobilize that for people, to directly address their concerns around suicide and the vulnerability of young people.